The dust rose in amber clouds along the dirt road that cut through the endless cotton fields of rural Texas, announcing their arrival before anyone could see them. When the convoy of military trucks finally emerged through the heat shimmer of that sweltering afternoon in 1943, the entire county seemed to hold its breath. Inside those canvas-covered vehicles sat men who had crossed an ocean not as invaders, but as captives, German soldiers of the Wehrmacht, now prisoners of war being delivered to American soil like some strange cargo from a distant nightmare. For the farmers and their families who lined the fences to watch, the war had suddenly become terrifyingly real. No longer just radio broadcasts and newspaper headlines, but flesh and blood enemies walking among them. The camp materialized seemingly overnight on the Henderson property, transforming a section of grazing land into a sprawling compound of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fencing and guard towers. Local men hired as military police stood watch, with rifles slung over their shoulders, their faces a mixture of pride and unease at guarding foreign soldiers who spoke in harsh, unfamiliar syllables. The German prisoners emerged from the trucks blinking in the fierce Texas sunlight, their grey uniforms dusty and sweat-stained, their eyes revealing exhaustion that went deeper than the long journey. Some were barely old enough to shave, others carried the weathered faces of men who had seen too much, but all wore the same expression of displacement, of being impossibly far from home in a landscape as alien as the moon. The whispers spread through town like wildfire, carried in hushed conversations at the general store and across church pews on Sunday morning. Were these men dangerous, hardened Nazis who would slit their throats given half a chance? Or were they simply soldiers who had lost their war, as weary of fighting as everyone else? The ranch owner, old Thomas Henderson, assured everyone that the military had the situation under control, that these prisoners would provide much-needed labor for the harvest, while most able-bodied American men fought overseas. But assurances did little to ease the tension that now hung over the cotton fields like the oppressive summer heat, thick and inescapable. As the prisoners filed into formation for their first roll call on American soil, a strange new chapter began in this corner of Texas, where the battle lines of a world war had somehow reached across the ocean to redraw the boundaries of a community that thought itself safely distant from the fighting. Among the prisoners who shuffled through the gates that first day was Klaus Richter, a man whose hands bore the calluses of labor but whose mind carried the precision of education. Before the war had consumed his life, he had been an electrical engineer in Hamburg, designing circuit boards and wiring systems for civilian buildings, a profession that seemed to belong to another lifetime, another world entirely. Now those same hands gripped nothing more than a canvas sack containing his few possessions, and his engineering degree meant less than the prisoner number stenciled on his uniform. As he surveyed the camp that would become his home for an indefinite future, Klaus felt the weight of displacement settle into his bones, the peculiar exhaustion of a man who had survived battles only to find himself trapped in a peaceful landscape that somehow felt just as hostile. What struck him most in those first days was not the heat, though it was suffocating, nor the unfamiliar food, though it sat heavy and strange in his stomach. It was the invisible lines that seemed to govern every interaction on the ranch, boundaries more rigid than the barbed wire surrounding the camp. He watched as white foremen barked orders at black workers who labored in separate crews, who ate at different times, who walked different paths to and from the fields. The German prisoners, Klaus realized with growing bewilderment, occupied a strange middle territory in this hierarchy. Enemy soldiers who were nonetheless treated with more basic dignity than American citizens whose only crime was the color of their skin. Klaus had grown up hearing the poisonous rhetoric of the Nazi Party, had watched his country descend into madness, convinced of its own superiority and the inferiority of others deemed undesirable. He had never been a true believer, had kept his head down and his opinions private to protect his family, but the propaganda had been inescapable. seeping into every aspect of German life like contaminated water. Yet here in Texas, an ocean away from the Third Reich, he witnessed a different kind of segregation, one that operated under different justifications, but produced the same casual cruelty, the same degradation of human dignity. Standing in the evening formation, as the sun painted the sky the color of rust and blood, Klaus found himself studying the faces of the black farmhands returning from the distant fields, wondering what thoughts passed behind their guarded expressions. One man in particular caught his attention, tall and lean with graying temples, who carried himself with quiet dignity despite the obvious exhaustion that weighted his shoulders. Their eyes met for just a moment across the segregated space, two men from impossibly different worlds, before a guard's sharp command broke the connection and reminded Klaus exactly where he stood in this strange new prison without walls. Samuel Washington had lived his entire 43 years within a 20-mile radius of that Texas cotton ranch. Born in a sharecropper's cabin that no longer existed, raised in fields that had drunk the sweat of 3 generations of his family. His hands told the story of that life in raised scars and permanent soil stains that no amount of washing could remove, in joints that ached with the memory of cotton bolls picked and irrigation ditches dug and fence posts driven into earth that fought back with every strike. He had a wife named Ruth, who worked as a domestic in town, 2 daughters who had moved north to Chicago seeking lives their father could only imagine, and a son buried in a cemetery for colored folks, taken by pneumonia before his 5th birthday. The war that consumed the world beyond this corner of rural Texas felt both impossibly distant and uncomfortably close. A storm whose winds occasionally reached even here, stirring up dust and unsettling the established order just enough to make everyone nervous. The arrival of the German prisoners had changed the rhythm of the ranch, in ways both obvious and subtle, adding new complications to an already complex social landscape governed by unwritten rules that everyone understood. Samuel had been warned by the ranch owner, a hard-faced man named Dalton who viewed compassion as weakness, that any interaction with the POWs beyond necessary work coordination would result in immediate dismissal, or worse. The military guards had delivered similar warnings with hands resting meaningfully on holstered pistols, making clear that fraternization was forbidden, that these enemy soldiers were not to be spoken to, approached, or acknowledged beyond the absolute minimum required by shared labor. Samuel had nodded his understanding, recognizing the familiar weight of restrictions designed to keep him in his designated place, another set of invisible chains added to those he had worn his entire life. Yet despite these prohibitions, he found himself curious about these men from across the ocean, these soldiers who had fought for a regime whose hatred seemed, from what little Samuel understood, to encompass people who looked nothing like him. He worked the eastern fields while they labored in the west, their paths crossing only at the irrigation pump house where water was distributed according to a strict schedule that kept the groups perpetually separated. Sometimes he would see them in the distance, pale figures moving through rows of cotton, and he wondered what thoughts occupied minds shaped by such different circumstances, whether they viewed him with the contempt he had learned to expect from white men, or whether displacement had taught them something about the arbitrary nature of the hierarchies that governed human interaction. On a Tuesday that felt no different from 1,000 others, Samuel was assigned to repair a damaged irrigation gate in the far northern section, a remote area where the land sloped toward a seasonal creek that ran fast and dangerous after heavy rain. He worked alone, as he often did, his tools spread on the muddy bank, his attention focused on the corroded metal that needed replacing before the evening watering schedule. The sky to the west had been threatening since midday, dark clouds gathering with ominous intent, but he had learned long ago that his discomfort mattered less than the completion of assigned tasks, that seeking shelter from approaching storms was a privilege reserved for others. not for men whose value was measured only in the labor their bodies could provide until those bodies finally gave out. The ranch operated according to an intricate choreography of separation, invisible lines drawn across the Texas soil with the same precision the military applied to Jianchang. Boundaries an ocean away, German prisoners worked the western cotton fields under armed supervision, their grey work clothes distinguishing them from both the khaki uniformed guards and the worn denim of the black farmhands who laboured in parallel isolation to the east. Meals were taken at different times in different locations, with the Germans eating at long tables near the converted barn that served as their barracks, while Samuel and the other black workers took their lunch in whatever shade they could find, tin pails containing food prepared by wives who rose before dawn to pack them. Water buckets were marked, tools were designated, even the dirt paths between fields had become territories governed by unspoken protocols that everyone understood would be enforced with swift consequences for those foolish enough to test them. The military guards patrolled these boundaries with varying degrees of enthusiasm, some treating their assignment as tedious duty, far from real combat, others relishing the authority that came with overseeing men stripped of freedom and dignity. Sergeant Morrison, a thick-shouldered man from Alabama, whose drawl carried the weight of generations of certainty about the proper order of things, made his expectations clear during the first week of the labor program. He gathered everyone within earshot and announced that the Germans were enemy. Prisoners, who would be treated according to Geneva Convention standards, fed adequately and housed appropriately, while making pointed eye contact with Samuel and the other black workers when he added that existing ranch hierarchies would be respected without exception, that military authority did not supersede local customs regarding who spoke to, whom or who stood where, or who drank from which dipper in the community water barrel. Klaus observed these arrangements with the detached curiosity of an engineer examining a complex machine whose function he could describe without fully understanding its purpose. He had fought in a war justified by proclamations of racial superiority, had worn the uniform of a regime built on hateful hierarchies, yet the casual cruelty he witnessed daily on this Texas ranch operated according to a different logic, one that separated men by skin tone rather than nationality, that granted enemy soldiers privileges denied to American citizens, whose only crime was ancestry. He kept these observations to himself, sharing them with neither the other prisoners nor the guards, understanding that curiosity about such matters could be interpreted as criticism, and criticism from a Wehrmacht captive would not be received kindly by men who already viewed his very presence as an affront. The work itself provided the only democratic element of their existence, cotton bowls and irrigation ditches caring nothing for the politics of the hands that tended them. Sweat tasted the same regardless of who shed it. Muscles ached with equal intensity whether they belonged to former soldiers or lifetime farmhands, and the Texas sun burned all skin it touched, though some burned easier than others, and some had shade provided while others did not. The storm arrived without the courtesy of gradual warning, rolling across the flat Texas landscape like an invading army, turning the late afternoon sky from pale blue to bruised purple in the span of minutes that felt like heartbeats. Samuel had been working the irrigation gate in the south field, the most remote section of the ranch where the cotton rows ended and wild grass began, a place where men labored alone because the work required only one pair of hands, and the owner saw no reason to waste additional labor on tasks that solitude could accomplish. He had noticed the darkening horizon, but made the calculation that countless farmhands had made before him, weighing the risk of leaving work unfinished against the danger of staying too long, and like so many others throughout history, he chose wrong. The first drops fell heavy as gravel, and within moments the deluge transformed the world into a grey curtain of water that erased everything beyond arm's reach, turning familiar ground into treacherous uncertainty. The old irrigation gate, a structure of wood and rusted metal that had regulated water flow for longer than Samuel had been alive, chose that precise moment to fulfill its destiny of mechanical failure. He had been adjusting the control wheel when the supporting beam gave way with a sound like a rifle shot, the entire framework collapsing sideways and catching his left leg beneath its considerable weight, pinning him in mud that seemed determined to swallow him whole. Pain arrived as a white explosion behind his eyes, then settled into a grinding ache that pulsed with each heartbeat, and he understood immediately the mathematics of his situation, trapped alone, in a place where no one would think to look until morning, with water already rising around him, as the storm fed the irrigation channel beyond its capacity. He called out, knowing the futility of it, his voice swallowed by thunder and distance, the rain filling his mouth with the taste of earth and desperation. Darkness came early under the storm, clouds turning late afternoon into premature night, and Samuel felt the cold water climbing past his waist toward his chest, each inch a countdown he could measure against his own ribs. He thought of his wife and the breakfast she had packed that morning, of his daughter who would be setting the table about now expecting him home, of all the small, ordinary moments that constituted a life and how quickly they could be reduced to memory. His hands clawed at the gate frame, searching for leverage that did not exist, muscles straining against weight and physics that cared nothing for his desperation, and he wondered with strange clarity whether this was how his story would end, not in some dramatic fashion, but simply drowned in a Texas field while the war raged elsewhere and the world continued its indifferent turning. The water reached his shoulders when he heard something that might have been imagination or might have been salvation. Footsteps splashing through mud, a voice calling out in accented English, the sound of another human presence in the darkness where he had resigned himself to dying alone. Klaus Richter had been the last man to leave the work detail that evening, lingering behind the others because he had dropped his identification tag in the mud near the equipment shed, and knew that losing it would mean 3 days in isolation, a punishment he could not afford with winter approaching and his already meager rations stretched thin. He had found it finally, pressed into the earth like a grave marker, and was making his way back toward the camp perimeter when the sound reached him through the rain, a human voice rising and falling between the thundercracks, desperate and fading. Every instinct screamed at him to keep walking, to pretend he had heard nothing, because the rules were absolute and carved into his consciousness through weeks of orientation. Prisoners did not deviate from assigned paths, did not interact with civilian workers, did not insert themselves into American affairs under any circumstances whatsoever. The guards had been clear that violations would result in immediate solitary confinement or transfer to the hardship camps in the Northern Territories, where men returned hollow-eyed and 20 pounds lighter if they returned at all. But Klaus had been an engineer before the war, trained to solve problems and calculate risks, and he understood that some equations contained variables more important than self-preservation. He turned toward the sound, his boots sinking into saturated earth with each step, moving away from safety and toward whatever trouble awaited him in the darkness beyond the designated work zone. The voice grew clearer as he approached the irrigation channel, and he could distinguish words now, a man calling for help with the particular quality of someone who no longer expected to be heard, but continued anyway, because silence felt too much like surrender. Klaus quickened his pace, rain streaming down his face and soaking through his prison-issue uniform, until he felt as much part of the storm as separate from it. And when he finally reached the collapsed gate structure, he saw Samuel trapped beneath it, water climbing toward his chin, eyes reflecting what little light remained in the drowning day. "Hold on," Klaus called out in his careful English, the words feeling inadequate against the magnitude of the situation, and he saw recognition flash across Samuel's face, not gratitude yet, but surprise that anyone had come at all, let alone someone wearing the enemy's uniform. Klaus circled the wreckage quickly, his engineer's mind already cataloguing the weight distribution and structural failures, calculating leverage points and force requirements with the automatic precision of his former profession. The gate frame was too heavy to lift directly, perhaps 300 pounds of waterlogged wood and iron, and Samuel was pinned at an angle that made simple pulling impossible without causing further injury or driving him deeper into the mud that held him like quicksand. "I'm going to get you out," Klaus said, speaking as much to himself as to Samuel, making a promise that his rational mind knew might be impossible to keep, but that some deeper part of him insisted had to be spoken aloud. He thought of Hamburg burning under Allied bombs, of his sister's letters that no longer arrived, of all the arbitrary lines that men drew between each other and called civilization, and he decided that here in this flooded Texas field, beneath a storm that recognized no borders, he would choose to be the man his younger self had believed he might become. Samuel nodded once, conserving his strength, and in that moment of mutual understanding across every boundary that separated them, nationality, race, language, circumstance, something fundamental shifted. A small defiance against the machinery of division that had brought them both to this impossible meeting. Klaus dropped to his knees beside the trapped man, hands already moving across the twisted metal framework with methodical urgency, his fingertips reading the structure like braille as rain hammered against his back and turned the ground beneath him into soup. He had no tools, no equipment, nothing but the wire cutters he had pocketed from the workshed earlier that day, and the scattered debris of the collapsed irrigation system surrounding them like the wreckage of some metal beast. His mind raced through calculations of weight and counterforce, searching for the principle that would move this immovable object, and then he remembered the fence posts he had seen 30 yards back along the channel. Metal stakes driven deep into harder ground that might serve as anchors. "I need to leave you for a moment," he told Samuel, whose breathing had grown shallow and rapid, shock beginning to settle into his features like frost. "I will come back, I promise you this." He ran through the darkness with his hands outstretched, feeling more than seeing his way back to where the fence line began, and he found the posts by colliding with them, his shoulder striking metal hard enough to send pain shooting down his arm. Using the wire cutters and his own body weight, he worked the first post loose from the saturated earth, rocking it back and forth until it came free with a sucking sound, then repeated the process with 2 more, dragging them back to the collapsed gate like a man hauling pieces of salvation. Samuel watched without speaking, conserving what strength remained, and Klaus saw the water had risen another inch, now lapping at the corners of the trapped man's mouth during each labored breath. Working with fingers that had gone numb from cold and exertion, Klaus began constructing his lever system, threading irrigation wire through the gate framework and around the posts he had driven into the ground at angles that would maximize mechanical advantage, creating a crude but functional pulley arrangement that would distribute the lifting force across multiple points. "When I pull, you must try to slide backward," Klaus explained, positioning himself at the wire junction point where all his improvised lines converged, his boots braced against a partially submerged rock for purchase. "Do not try to help with your leg. Just use your arms and your good leg to push yourself free when the weight lifts." Samuel nodded, his jaw set with determination that transcended the agony Klaus knew he must be experiencing, and in that expression the German saw something he recognized from his own reflection during the worst moments of his captivity, the refusal to surrender, even when surrender seemed the only rational choice. Klaus wrapped the wire around his hands until it bit into his palms, took a breath that filled his lungs with rain-soaked air, and pulled with everything his body contained, feeling the makeshift pulley system take. The strain, as metal groaned and wood shifted incrementally upward. The gate rose 6 inches, then 8, Klaus screaming with effort as his muscles burned and the wire cut deeper into his hands. And Samuel was moving, dragging himself backward through the mud with agonizing slowness, while Klaus held the impossible weight suspended through nothing. But will and wire and the engineering principles he had learned in what felt like another lifetime. Then Samuel was clear, rolling away from the gate's shadow, and Klaus released the wire, letting the structure crash back into the water as he collapsed forward onto his hands and knees, gasping like a drowning man himself, blood from his torn palms. Mixing with the rain and mud beneath him, while somewhere in the distance, flashlight beams cut through the darkness and voices shouted their names with authority that promised consequences neither man could yet imagine. The flashlight beams found them in stages, first illuminating the collapsed gate like a crime scene, then sweeping across. Samuel's mud-caked form lying in the shallows, and finally settling on Klaus, who knelt nearby with his torn hands still dripping crimson threads into the water that pooled around his knees. Corporal Hendricks arrived first, his service pistol drawn, and his face twisted with an expression that combined confusion with procedural fury. Followed closely by 2 other guards, whose weapons also pointed toward the German prisoner with an authority that needed no translation. Behind them came the ranch foreman, a thick-necked man named Morrison, whose boots splashed through the flooded field with the heavy certainty of someone accustomed to finding his expectations confirmed, his eyes moving. Between the 2 men, as though reading a familiar story written in an unfamiliar language. The rain continued its relentless percussion against helmets and shoulders, while the gathered men formed a loose circle around what could have been either a rescue or a transgression, depending entirely on which lens of judgment they chose to apply. "Step away from him, Richter," Hendricks ordered, his voice carrying the mechanical precision of military protocol, overriding whatever human response might have existed beneath the uniform. Klaus raised his hands slowly, palms forward, in a gesture of surrender that had become second nature during his months of captivity, the wire cuts across his flesh, now clearly visible in the harsh, artificial light that made them look like stigmata. Samuel tried to speak, to explain, but his words emerged as little more than gasps, his body finally succumbing to the shock that adrenaline had temporarily held at bay, and 2 of the ranch hands moved forward to lift him onto a makeshift stretcher constructed from fence boards and canvas. Morrison walked a slow circle around the collapsed irrigation structure, examining the improvised pulley system with the careful attention of a man assessing both mechanical ingenuity and social violation, his weathered face revealing nothing. "You broke about 7 different regulations tonight, prisoner," Hendricks said, holstering his weapon now that the immediate threat assessment had resolved itself into something requiring paperwork rather than bullets. Klaus nodded, understanding the words, even if their full legal implications remained obscure, his German accent thickening with exhaustion as he replied that a man was drowning and regulations seemed a distant concern compared to that fundamental fact. The corporal's jaw tightened, caught between the rule book that governed his authority and the undeniable reality that the prisoner's violation had prevented a death that would have required far more complicated documentation. Morrison finally spoke, his Texas drawl carrying across the rain-soaked field with surprising clarity, saying only that they would sort this out in the morning when men could think clearly. But for now, the German would return to the camp under armed escort while Samuel received medical attention. The guards positioned themselves on either side of Klaus, not quite touching him, but close enough that their proximity defined his boundaries, and as they began the long walk back toward the camp's perimeter lights, Klaus turned once to see Samuel being carried in the opposite direction, their eyes meeting across the darkness in a moment of recognition that transcended every rule and boundary that had been constructed to keep their worlds separate, a silent, Acknowledgement that something had shifted in the fundamental order of things, though whether that shift would be honored or punished remained a question suspended in the space between lightning and thunder. The morning sun arrived with the harsh clarity of Judgment Day, transforming the camp commandant's office into a makeshift courtroom where the weight of military regulation pressed against the uncomfortable reality of human decency. Major William Prescott sat behind his government-issue desk with the folders and reports arranged before him like evidence at trial, his career-weathered face suggesting a man who had learned that war created situations no training manual adequately addressed. Klaus stood at attention between two guards, his bandaged hands clasped behind his back, while Samuel waited on a wooden bench outside the door, where the muffled voices carried through the walls like distant thunder. His splintered legs stretched before him as a testament to the previous night's violence and mercy. Morrison occupied the corner of the room with his hat held against his chest, and beside him stood his son Thomas, a lanky 16-year-old, whose presence nobody had anticipated, but whose testimony would prove impossible to ignore. "My boy was out checking the fence line when it happened," Morrison explained, his drawl carrying an unfamiliar hesitation that suggested internal conflict between what he believed and what he witnessed. Thomas stepped forward with the awkward courage of youth confronting adult certainty, describing how he had watched through the rain as the German prisoner worked frantically to save Samuel's life, using intelligence and compassion where hatred should have resided, according to everything the war's propaganda had taught them to expect. The Major listened without interruption, his fingers drumming a slow rhythm against the desk's scarred surface, while Klaus remained motionless, except for the barely perceptible tremor in his shoulders that betrayed exhaustion beyond the physical. Morrison's jaw worked silently as his son spoke, and something shifted in the foreman's expression when Thomas described how the German's hands bled from the wire and how he never stopped working even when the gate's weight seemed impossible to move, treating Samuel not as an enemy or inferior, but simply as a man whose life held equal value. Prescott stood and walked to the window where the camp's orderly rows of barracks stretched toward the cotton fields that connected German prisoners and black farmhands in the strange mathematics of wartime labor. His decision arrived not with dramatic pronouncement, but with the quiet firmness of a commander who understood that rules existed to preserve order, yet order without humanity became its own form of tyranny. Klaus would face no court-martial, only a formal reprimand placed in files that would matter little once the war concluded, and Samuel would receive commendation for his work ethic despite the accident that nearly claimed his life. Morrison cleared his throat and said he would assign both men to the same irrigation detail going forward, his words carrying the weight of concession that cost him something in the currency of his upbringing. And Thomas smiled slightly, as though witnessing his father's reluctant evolution toward grace. The hearing concluded with handshakes that felt ceremonial, small gestures acknowledging that the previous night's events had revealed fractures in the certainties that governed their segregated world, proving that courage and compassion recognized no boundaries when measured against the fundamental value of human life. Klaus passed Samuel in the hallway afterward, and their brief nod contained entire conversations about dignity and recognition, about how two men from opposite sides of every conceivable divide had found common ground in mud and rain and desperation, creating a quiet testament to the possibility that even war's rigid categories could not fully contain the complicated truth of human connection. The years that followed moved with the inexorable rhythm of history reshaping itself, carrying Klaus, Richter and Samuel Washington along separate currents that nevertheless remained forever altered by that single night when rain and desperation dissolved the boundaries others had constructed. Klaus returned to Hamburg in the spring of 1946, aboard a crowded transport ship, finding his city transformed into mountains of rubble where familiar streets once stood, and he worked alongside other survivors, rebuilding electrical systems for a Germany that needed to reinvent itself from ashes and shame. Samuel remained on Texas soil, but left Morrison's ranch within the year, moving to Houston, where defense plants transitioning to peacetime production offered black workers opportunities previously unimaginable, and he found employment as a skilled machinist, his capable hands proving what prejudice had always denied. They exchanged letters sporadically across the Atlantic, simple correspondence that spoke of weather and work and small triumphs, never directly addressing the night that bound them, but acknowledging it. In every careful line, like a shared language only they understood, the bond between them existed not in dramatic gestures, but in quiet recognition that witnessing another's full humanity changes you irrevocably, making it impossible to accept the comfortable lies that divide people into categories of worthy and disposable. Klaus married a schoolteacher named Greta, who had survived the firebombing, and when their daughter asked about his time in America, he spoke about the Texas night, when he learned that courage meant choosing compassion over obedience, that the real enemy had never been the men working the cotton fields, but the ideologies that taught them to see each other as less than human. Samuel raised 3 sons who attended integrated schools and universities their father could never have imagined, and he told them about the German prisoner who risked punishment to save his life, explaining that progress required individuals willing to act justly before the world caught up with demanding it. Their correspondence continued through decades marked by civil rights struggles and Cold War tensions, 2 men whose friendship existed as living proof that even war's most rigid divisions contained spaces where humanity persisted. In 1983, Klaus traveled to Houston for what both men understood would likely be their final meeting, their bodies bearing the accumulated weight of nearly 4 decades since that rain-soaked rescue. They sat on Samuel's porch, drinking sweet tea, while grandchildren played in the yard, and the silence between them felt comfortable and complete, containing all the words that mattered without requiring them spoken. Klaus returned to Hamburg carrying photographs and memories, and when he passed 2 years later, Greta found among his possessions a rusted piece of fence wire carefully preserved in a wooden box, a relic from the night when 2 strangers became brothers through the simple act of recognizing each other's equal claim to life and dignity. The irrigation gate where it happened was replaced long ago, and Morrison's ranch eventually subdivided into housing developments where families live unaware of the history beneath their foundations. But the story persisted in the way important truths do, passed down as testament to the possibility that even humanity's darkest hours contain moments when ordinary people choose extraordinary grace. Samuel's sons still have the letters Klaus sent, documents more valuable than any historical archive, because they speak to the complicated reality that people are never simply the roles assigned them, that enemy and friend, black and white, prisoner and free, are categories too crude to contain the fullness of human capacity for connection. The war ended, and the camps closed, and the strict segregation that seemed eternal eventually crumbled. But what endured was the simple fact that on one desperate night, 2 men saw past everything designed to keep them apart and chose instead the harder path of recognizing their shared humanity, creating a legacy that outlasted all the boundaries others built. What would you have done in Klaus's position that stormy night? Subscribe to hear more stories of courage that changed history.